Today is July the 22nd, 2013, and I'm sitting in the Charach's home with Manny Charach doing an oral history interview for the Albert Dubin Leadership Project. And Manny, we are so delighted to be here. And can I ask you a question?
Yes.
Is it possible that we can use the material that we speak about today as in an educational forum?
As long as you don't bring up the sex.
Oh, all right, we won't, I promise. So when we do these interviews, we like to start with family history and talk about your family as you remember them and as far back as you remember. So tell me about your parents and your grandparents.
Well, my grandparents came from Russia. We believe my father was from Poland. We're not too certain because he never spoke too much about his youth. However, in going back and looking and listening, we believe he was from Poland. One of the reasons I say that is my mother, of course, came from Russia, and her mother, when she was alive, stayed in our home back in Pittsburgh, and they spoke a lot of Yiddish. My father never spoke Yiddish, so I don't believe that there was a time in his life that Yiddish was an important part of it. I mean, he knew and things like that, but I mean, basically he never spoke the language. So whenever he wanted to speak, my mother and my grandma, they spoke in Yiddish. My mother's father was a cantor. She was born and raised in Odessa, and he left Odessa when he had a chance to come to Canada originally. A relative said he found a place for him in Canada, so in 1914 he left all alone. He left my mother, her 3 sisters, and a brother. And then 3 years later, in November of 1917, he sent a letter finally saying, please send Clara. That was my mother's name. So she was given enough money from her mother and her other relatives to leave and come to Canada. Her trip took her 9 months.
Oh my goodness.
From Odessa to Vladivostok, and that was during World War I. You had 2 revolutions, and then you had the White Army, and you had the Black Army, and whatever else came in, Cossacks. She barely made it, excepting because of her youth, and she was born in 1900. She was hidden most of the times when they would be attacked by Cossacks or Red Russians. Women would hide her under their skirts.
She traveled alone?
All alone. She made the book all alone. She made it all by herself, yes. So it was an interesting trip.
Well, she must have been a remarkable person.
Well, she was a toughie.
Yeah.
She was really tough. And when we finally settled down years later, her sisters all came, her family all moved to Winnipeg, and then from Winnipeg we wound up in Pittsburgh because her father eventually became a cantor there.
Oh.
So at that point, when the sisters had daughters, for the most part, they would come to our house, they would sit on the floor, and my mother would regale them with her story of the 9 months that she traveled, which is why I told you about the book. So it would be interesting reading.
It evolved into a book.
Yes, it evolved into a book. And my dad never said much about his early life. He wound up in Winnipeg. I don't know the year, but he and my mother got married in 1924. My dad was a barber, his father was a barber, and his grandfather was a barber. Early life, as a young man in Pittsburgh, I was born in 1925, so when we had our first depression, I knew what it was to live in a poor home.
What was it like?
My father would do a shave and a haircut for 25 cents. There used to be a song, shave and a haircut, 2 bits.
Yeah, that's where it came from.
So when he came home, if he had a few pennies in his pocket, he always went to the blue box, and he always put a few pennies in the blue box. Not that he was outwardly philanthropic, because he didn't have that much money, but he believed that whatever you have, you can share. And he did share, which I think was a good way for me to learn about giving money. And I have to say that it was the beginning of it.
Was it a religious home?
Not so great a religious home. My mother carried more religion than my father due to the fact that her father was a cantor. We did keep kosher until the time I went into the service. And when I came home, things had changed a bit. It wasn't as kosher as it had been before. However, they were proud Jews. They wanted to be religious. They couldn't afford it. One of the saddest periods of my life was they went to a synagogue for the holidays, and I was with them, and they were asked to leave because they didn't have a membership. And that has always bothered me to this day. I don't feel that it was proper, but, religion is religion. Now, as far as Natalie and I, we're very proud to be Jewish. We're staunch believers in Israel. We're staunch believers in Judaism. We have a religious school that we have founded. However, I won't say that we're overly religious, but I will say that we are religious.
So did you get a religious education as a young man?
Yes, I did get, as things progressed, I did have a bar mitzvah. I was bar mitzvah in 1938. That was a good many years ago. I did know how to read Hebrew, but I must say that I haven't fallen through since then. But I can go into a synagogue and hold a book, and I'd probably be 40 pages behind the rabbi, but I can still read the book.
Did you have siblings?
I have a brother, yes. He was born 13 years after I was born, yes.
And did you go through the educational system
In Pittsburgh? Oh, yes. Yeah. I actually spent the full 12 years from kindergarten to high school. I graduated in 1943, and the next day I was wearing an Army uniform. So I was in the Army on my 18th birthday.
So what were your war experiences?
My war experiences? Well, I did participate in the invasion of France on D-Day.
Oh.
So I was there.
Tell us about that.
I wound up being on the Elbe River in Germany on the day that the war ended, because across the river were the Russians. We were told to stop. So I had a very good experience in and during World War II, yes. And as a matter of fact, I was in training in Marseille, France, when the war ended in Europe, to prepare to go to Japan for an invasion, which fortunately never came about. So
how many years were you in the service?
Well, I went in 1943 and I came out in 1945, a little over 2 years, 2.5 years. Yeah.
What were the lessons you learned from those years?
Be tough if you're Jewish.
Did you encounter a lot of anti-Semitism?
Well, I had a few incidences, but one that I always talk about and laugh about, because I had enlisted in the service. I went over as a single individual, as a replacement, and this is prior to the invasion. And I landed in Europe, in England, I should say, and I was assigned to a tank. And the day that the lieutenant took me to the tank, which I was assigned to, I looked at it, and the name on the tank was D-A-G-O, Dago.
Oh.
You understand what
Sure,
Dago is?
Of course.
Okay. So I was assigned to be the gunner on that tank. The next day, the lieutenant came back and said, "Charach, I wish to talk to you." So I got into his Jeep and we drove away. He says, "They don't want you." And I asked why, and of course he couldn't tell me. So we had a little discussion, and he said, "What do you think?" And I said, frankly, "Tell them to go to hell."
So did you wind up on what tank?
Not only did I wind up on the tank, I wound up in 2 months being the leader. Still have. There's one of us left. He's Italian. He was the young man that they actually named the tank after.
Oh, really?
He was truly a Dago from Chicago. And Leo is still alive, and he lives in New Mexico, and we talk once a month on the phone. And the last words he says to me is, "I love you." So we've had a good relationship, yes.
So you came back in 45, and what did you do then?
In 1945, well, I had a great thing going for me for 52 weeks. We called it the 52-20 Club. Veterans were entitled to get a $20 check every week for 52 weeks as restitution. And I came out of service in December of 45. In February, I got a phone call from a young lady in Detroit who said her brother wished to have me come for his 21st birthday. Now, he was Jewish, by the way. He was a replacement. One of our guys had been injured, so they replaced him with another Jew. So 2 Jews on a tank called Dago. So I came to Detroit, and I came on a Greyhound bus overnight. I landed here in Detroit on a Saturday morning, and the first thing he said to me was, I met a girl from Pittsburgh, but she don't know you. I says, fine. He says, but we're going to visit her. And so he took me out to visit the young lady, and I don't think she liked him too well because she certainly didn't want to impress me.
What did she look like?
Well, if you had a dictionary and you could see the word under ugly, there's a picture. You might find Natalie's picture there if they still make that dictionary. She did everything she could not to look pretty, which was very impressive as far as I was concerned. But she was very witty, very sharp, and she knew all my friends. In fact, my best friend was her next-door neighbor back home in Pittsburgh. So we had something in common, and yet we didn't realize it at that point. So it worked out well. After 67 years, I think it worked out.
But, well, tell me about your courtship.
My courtship? Very short. I hope she told you. Well, we met on a Saturday. I proposed to her on a Sunday night, which was the next night. I went home on Monday morning. I told my parents I'm going to get married, and I think I can still hear my mother yelling, "To who?" To who? And the second word was, "Is she Jewish?" I says, "Yes, she's Jewish." But our courtship was very short. After, I would say about a month or so, we had our courtship over the telephone, basically. We spoke to each other maybe 2-3 times a week. And Natalie said, if we're going to get married, I have to tell you, you're going to have to move to Detroit. And I said, willingly. I was only in Detroit for 2 days, but I was quite impressed with what I saw. In those days, Detroit really was a beautiful city, no question about it. So on the 5th of April of 1946, I got off a Greyhound bus again. I had my little cardboard suitcase. I must have had a few civilian clothes at the time. I can't recall. But I remember I had $7 in my pocket. And I came to Detroit. No friends, other than the one guy that was in the Army with me.
That was Red?
Yep, Red. And no history as far as schools or anything like that. So Natalie's mother was very kind. She took me in as a boarder. I had no money, but she took me in as a boarder. And then one morning, as I was reading the Detroit Times, do you remember the Detroit Times?
I do.
There was a lot of ads in newspapers for people to go to work in factories and so forth. And half the positions, I didn't even know what they meant, but it was all factory work. Natalie called me from her job. Thank God she was making $37.50 a week. She always adds the 50 cents.
Oh,
so
that was a
very
big deal.
important. And I had no job at all. And she said, you know, we're going to get married in Pittsburgh, or New Kensington, which is where her uncles had lived, and they were the only ones that could afford to pay for the wedding. And we have to go through a rigmarole with getting a blood test and all that. And we have the Jewish holidays coming. She knew more about it than I did. She says, but we can get married today. I says, how can we get married today? She says, this young lady who works here, she has a friend, and he knows the judge, and he's made arrangements for us to get married. I says, when? She says, on my lunch hour. So she told me how to get downtown, to get off a bus at Kearns Clock, and she met me at Kearns Clock a little afternoon while she was on her lunch hour with her friend. I think the friend's name was Leota, if I'm not mistaken. And we rushed to the county courthouse. We got married by Judge Murphy. I don't recall the name of the gentleman who was the best man, but he was her girlfriend's boyfriend at the time. And when the judge asked me, or I said to the judge, how much do I owe you? He says, oh, anything. So Natalie had to give me $5 for the judge, and then she gave me a few more dollars to take our best man to lunch. She went back to work with her friend. I went looking for a job.
Did you find it?
Not that day, but a week later I did find a job. I got a job as a salesman right on Woodward and Adams. It was called Brooks Brothers. It was a men's clothing store. And so I went to work on my first day, which was a Saturday, and I was there at 9 o'clock. I reported to work. I never had any experience working in a store or any other thing. I came right out of high school, went in the Army. So they showed me where the ties were and the shirts were. It was a very fancy store. And just about noon, the manager said to me, "You can go to lunch now." And I said, "How long do I have?" He says, "An hour." So I went for lunch, and then I went directly home. So when I came home now, he says, "How's your job?" I says, "Well, I don't think I can work in a store. I have to stand on my feet all day." So I didn't quit. I just left for lunch and never went back. Well, from the period of 1946 to the time I started our own business, that's 11 years. I had 10 different jobs. They were all sewing. So it was just a little bit of hard work, perseverance, and trying to work our way up, and finally
What kind of work did you do in that 11?
Sewing. Yeah, I was, as I always tell people, Levi Strauss, he was a peddler. So was I. I was a peddler.
Clothing or a variety of them?
Oh, I had many, many types of jobs, but eventually when I did settle down, I settled down basically selling appliances and electronics. I was there when television first came out, and I was hired by a local company at the time to sell a line of television by the name of Olympic. I don't think anybody ever heard of Olympic.
Didn't last too long, huh?
It didn't last too long. No, because in those days everybody was coming out with television sets. But that was the beginning of my selling career, and as it wound up, I eventually got more involved with electronics, and I sold some. I think my second job or third job in town was really a good one. I was hired by a local company that made Jewish records.
Oh.
Yeah, Jewish records. So I used to have a bag of Jewish records, and I would walk up and down
Where?
on Dexter and on Hastings, calling on the various record shops. And with good luck, we had a hit. It was called Joe and Paul
Fargenegant. So talk about Hastings Street. Not too many people remember it. What was it like?
Hastings Street was an interesting place. We had a number of record shops on Hastings Street. Most of them were in barber shops, would you believe? I would say 7 out of 10 were actually owned by colored people, but we had a few Jewish people who were still in business there. One man had about the biggest distribution of records I've ever seen or ever saw in my life. And we called him the Mad Russian, and he was a Mad Russian. I don't remember his real name, but he was really something. And I spent a lot of time in his store, and I learned a lot from him. But I used to walk up and down Hastings Street with a little box of sample records, 78 RPM records that sold for 79-cent retail. I made a living.
Were there a lot of other Jewish businesses on that street at that point?
At that point, yes. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. Hastings Street was very, very an interesting street in many ways. I mean, we had a predominance of black, but I would say the 60-40 would be the mix. And the Jewish businesses thrived at that time, and it was certainly not like Hastings Street would be in 2013.
Of course. And the neighborhood, were there still Jews living adjacent to it?
In the area, yes. Oh, yes, there were quite a few. Not like there were on the Dexter area, because we lived off of Dexter and Tyler, and of course, that was basically, as you would call, the Jewish ghetto. I came from a Jewish ghetto in Pittsburgh. It was called Squirrel Hill.
Oh.
A lot of people know what Squirrel Hill was, so we had the same thing here in Detroit.
So what was your experience coming to the city? You didn't know anybody but
I didn't know anyone at all.
But and Natalie, of course.
And Natalie, of course, had friends which she had gone to school with and had worked with. But over a period of time, I think we were very lucky because while living on Tyler and not making a lot of money, I think we were one of the first to buy a little 10-inch black and white television set. Well, in those days,
Right.
a black and white television set was like a magnet.
You were popular, right?
So we were very popular. We had people come to our house to watch whatever they could see, you know, Milton Berle and Sid Caesar, a little baseball, whatever the case may have been. Those were fun days, yeah. So we made a lot of friends, a lot of good friends, as a matter of fact, and still to this day. One of the lady who went with us, the young lady, I should say, to Pittsburgh on our synagogue wedding when we went to New Kensington, is still alive and very friendly with us, and so is her husband. So, I mean, these things have lasted a good many years together, yes.
So you're happy you made the move here.
I believe that if I said I was not happy, I was lucky to have made the move here. Yes. There was a big difference between Detroit at that time and Pittsburgh at that time. I think the things have reversed. Today, if I were a young man, I'd say Pittsburgh would be a better place to live in for the potential. But you couldn't beat the potential in Detroit after the war. It was very, very nice. It was a clean city. It was a pleasant city, and very proud of it. And we'll see how things work out in the coming years. But no, I've always enjoyed Detroit. Made a lot of friends.
So after you went into business after 11 years and 10 jobs, and so where did that business take you?
Well, in 1957, when I started, I actually started a company called Manny Charach Associates. What was it? It was manufacturers' representatives. A lot of people don't understand when you tell them what a manufacturer's representative is, so the best way to say is I'm a peddler. But I went to a trade show at that time, which was in Atlantic City. It was what they called the National Houseware Show. And at the National Houseware Show, I walked the boardwalk and shook hands and passed out a card. And I ran into some people who had known me, who were originally with the Olympic Television Company. Olympic Television had gone out of business. So they were just starting their own business at that time. And they gave me the card and said, why don't you come and visit us when the show opens on Sunday? And I said, well, what do you have? Oh, they says, well, one of the gentlemen whose brother had been in Japan during World War II, when the war started, he was imprisoned. And he stayed in prison, of course, till the war ended. And one night when he went to a bar, he met a few Japanese gentlemen who were starting up a new company. And the company, Sony, S-O-N-Y, something like that.
I've heard of that, yeah.
So they hired him to represent them in the United States. Well, having had a brother who was in the television business, he got his brother involved and they formed a new company. And so when I went to visit them, S-O-N-Y didn't mean a thing to me. And I was hired immediately to represent them, and I came home. I represented 3 or 4 different companies, but they were a little bit of this, a little bit of that. I had some teddy bears to sell. I had some binoculars, baseball gloves, things like that, imported. But of course, the only thing, and nobody knew what S-O-N-Y, and I say it because it was true at that time. I made a call to the buyer at the Good Housekeeping shops, and I had this little transistor radio with me, and I didn't have an appointment, and he wasn't a very pleasant person when I walked into his office. He said, you have no appointment? I said, I know, but I only have one item to show you. He said, well, go downstairs and make an appointment. I said, well, let me just show you this thing before I go downstairs. And he allowed me to do that. I put it on his table. He says, S-O-N-Y, what the heck is that? Believe me, I don't know what prompted me to say, well, you've heard of Standard Oil of New York, haven't you? He says, yes. I lied. I says, well, that's how they get their money out of the Far East. He became a buyer. He became a very good buyer. We became very close friends. But that was the beginning of S-O-N-Y, or Sony as we know it today. So it was the beginning of my profession as a manufacturer's agent.
Did you travel a lot in your work?
I did. At the point of travel, I had 3 states to cover, which was Michigan, Ohio, and Indiana, which was very fortunate. We had some good businesses in all 3 states. And I made a living, fortunately. I frankly have to say that I went into business as a manufacturer's agent, having borrowed money from a brother-in-law of mine who once said to me, "Why are you working for these other companies and you don't go into business for yourself?" Mm-hmm. I said I would if I had enough funds to provide my wife and 2 children with bread and water on the table. He says, "What would you need?" And I told him that I thought if I could have $100 a week for a year, I would be all right. He was very nice to me. He wrote me a check for $5,000, which I think I repaid many, many times.
It happens.
However, he got repaid within a year. So that was the beginning of it. And then, of course, in 1960, I got a phone call from a gentleman who wanted to come and visit me, and it was based on the fact that they had run an ad in the trade paper saying that a company was coming to the United States by the name of Matsushita. Matsushita. Well, I called that gentleman the next morning and I said, "How do you plan to go to business in the United States?" And he said, "We haven't made up our mind as yet, but what do you do?" I told him that I was a manufacturer's agent. And at that time, even though I was representing Sony, Rich I wasn't getting because Sony hadn't quite evolved as a big name yet. About 2 weeks later, he called. He says, "We're thinking we're going to hire manufacturer's agents, and I'd like to have you interview for the job," which I did. He hired me on the spot. He had 4 little radios wrapped up in towels that he carried in his suitcase. They were all with the name Matsushita. Well, he had no experience in the radio industry. I had a little bit more than he did. So 3 months later, he called me and said, "They would like to meet you in Japan." So that was my first trip to Japan. And I was taken first class to Japan by this gentleman. He was the sales manager at the time. And I met Japan's richest person, and he was Mr. Matsushita himself. And the reason I say he was Japan's richest person was that year he was on the cover of Time magazine, and it said he was Japan's richest person.
So
I have to believe
right,
it.
Exactly.
And I have that in my office
your
at
archives.
this moment. Well, in the meeting that we had with him, he asked me a question as to what do you think we have to do to be popular in the United States? I said, "Well, you know, you have a lot of competition in the United States, and your name, Matsushita, is very difficult to say." So one of the Japanese interpreters says, "Yes, we have that problem here in Japan." I says, "What do you mean?" He says, "Even in Japan, we don't have the name. We call our product national." And I says, "Oh, that's why I saw all the national signs on the train from Tokyo to Osaka. I didn't know who national was." "Oh," he said, "that's us." So then Mr. Matsushita, who spoke no English, said, "What do you think we ought to call ourselves?" I hadn't any idea at the time, but I said, "Well, let me think. We're in an area of sonic boom, and everything today is sonic." Well, in 3 days, we came up with the name Panasonic.
So you're responsible for
I'm responsible for that, yes.
So,
Have been known as Mr. Panasonic.
oh my, what a story. So
So it's luck.
luck
All luck.
and hard
Yes.
work.
Hard work.
Hard work and a little
Hard
faithful
work,
too.
luck, and perseverance,
Yeah.
yes. And that was really the beginning.